welcome. Thank you so much for asking me to speak today. I do warn you, I have a 4-month-old, so she's currently being fed by my husband in the other room. So if you hear her, I do apologize. I've got a few different things that I'm going to cut to, but I'll just start with a brief introduction of kind of who I am. So my name's Adrienne Stinson, and I'm a sport physiotherapist currently working out of Craven Sport Services. And kind of my career history, if you will. After graduating from the U of S, I moved out to Alberta and was working out in Jasper. Went back to the U of S and worked with Husky Athletics on and off for 10 plus years, working with those guys. Also doing some contract work with a few different national teams. I went and lived out at the Canadian Sports Centre out in Victoria and worked with rugby out there as a dedicated therapist for a few years with those guys, traveling the world with them. And most recently, I'm doing contract work with Athletics Canada, and then working with a bunch of different national team athletes, kind of in collaboration with Bruce over at Craven. And for the last few months, I've been at home taking care of a baby. So my life is completely different. As far as cycling goes, as much as I love it, I'm definitely not an expert when it comes to doing the activity myself. I do teach spin, but I'm not going to consider that to be cycling, so I will leave that where it is. But I've been a spin instructor over at Ride, and now I'm going to be starting with Freedom kind of in the next few months here when things get back up and going as well. And you'll see later on a few pictures of one of the 4 bikes that were stolen from my garage, unfortunately, not too long ago. So if you see it and you recognize it, it's custom, let me know. Somebody has my bike and I will be happy to grab it. But today, I understand we're going to be talking about basically warm up and cool down. And I wasn't sure as to what the age range would be. I knew it would be a little bit varied and who's going to be here today. So at any time, go ahead and stop me and ask questions and I will answer as best as I can. I've got 3 different screens going because, as I said, I'm not super great with tech. So I've got my notes on one screen, you guys on another screen, and then another screen in the corner just in case nothing works and I could flash it in front of you and you could all just look at it that way. So I've got a few different things set up that way, but we will get right to it. As far as my education, that side of things, I can answer any questions about that kind of stuff later. It's kind of boring. Nobody wants to read a CV, so let's just get right to it. And so this is the fun part. Now that we're on Zoom, I have to figure out how to go through. Okay, there we go. First bike that was stolen. You'll see it in the background there. So the warm-up. Essentially, when we're talking about a warm-up, we've got a physiological warm-up as well as a psychological warm-up. And so what I mean by that is we're not just talking about the body and why we're warming up the body, but we're also talking about how to warm up the mind and get ready for either a performance, a event, a competition, or for that training session that day. Physiologically, we're looking to gradually increase our heart rate, getting our cardiorespiratory system going to basically increase blood flow to skeletal muscle and increase our metabolic rate and bring up our core temperature. So those are kind of the main reasons physiologically that we would be doing a warm-up and why it's so important. And I'll get into that a little bit more in depth. So what we're looking at is we're looking at efficiency. And essentially, the reason we're doing a warm-up is we're trying to make our bodies the most efficient possible for when we actually get into the training session or we get into the competition at that time. Now, before I get into any of that, as far as this group goes, what type of cycling do most of you guys do? If you want to just throw into chat there. Are we cyclocross? Are we road racers? Are we mountain bikers? Are we doing a little bit of everything? Okay, I see road. road and mountain bike will be watching. Okay, so I don't need to go into some of those other things. Awesome. So I'll kind of try to keep references or try to bring things back to those 2 areas. Let me just close that down there. So when I'm talking about efficiency, we're talking about energy efficiency is one of the main things. And really what we want to do right at the beginning is we want to get our aerobic system going and start utilizing that energy base. There's different energy bases within within any type of activity, and depending on the length of that activity or of short bursts of exertion within that activity, you're going to use different energy banks. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that aerobic system is going right from the beginning and that it's working efficiently, so that we don't have premature fatigue within the workout or within the competition. So with that, what we're doing is we're looking to increase our heart rate. So we're prepping the cardiovascular system and getting that metabolic process going. So what we're really trying to do is we're trying to get an increase in blood flow to our extremities. So get it away from our central system to our extremities and increase the vasodilation. What this is going to do is it's going to bring O2, and basically through the Bohr effect, we're going to look at increasing the amount of oxygen and the exchange with hemoglobin to our skeletal muscle. So we're basically transporting it to the areas of the body that we need to start working. And we do that by increasing heart rate and by having large motor movement, which would go along with cycling. We're also looking at basically increasing our core temperature and then directing the blood flow away from the core and increasing the temperature of our extremities. And I'll get into why that's important for injury prevention here.
Adrienne, just one thing. I don't think we're seeing this slide. If you're changing slides at all, it's still on your, I think the very first slide on the screen.
Oh, you don't see why warm up physiological?
No, it says heat it up and cool it down still.
Okay, I have been changing slides and they're changing on me, but they're not changing on you. Okay, hold on a second. Well, let's see. If I click on this, it says I'm sharing my screen, but you guys are still just seeing the first slide, hey?
We're seeing your screen, and it looks like it's a PowerPoint, but yeah, it's not changing the slides throughout it.
Oh, okay, that's awesome. Here I was thinking I sorted it out. Okay, give me 2 seconds here. I'm gonna try turning off the screen sharing and then putting it back on. Because otherwise I made a PowerPoint for no reason. Okay, hold on a second here. And share screen. And advanced sharing options. One participant can share at a time. You don't have your screen shared at the moment, correct? Okay.
No.
So let's go into this guy. Let's try here. All right, what do you see? There we go.
Yeah, okay, it says why I'm warming up physiological now.
Okay, I'm going to just switch the slide and see whether you see the next slide.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Okay, sorry about that. I'll just go back. The other slide was just a nice picture of one of the bikes that was stolen, so nobody really needs it. Just makes me more sad than anything else. But I'll go ahead and skip by that slide and come back to this one. So again, here I was just talking about heart rate, blood flow, and where that blood is going and why it's important. Those were the main things that I kind of just talked about there. So I'll just get to that next slide. So basically what we're looking at here is we're looking at muscle temperature, and it's directly related to your ambient temperature. So how quickly you can actually heat it up. So when we're talking about bringing that heat to the skeletal muscle and the main muscles that we're using, it's important to be aware of what the ambient temperature is outside, especially as we ride in Saskatchewan. We have big temperature fluctuations. And so it's important when you're thinking about your warm up to be aware of what the temperature is outside and how long it's going to potentially take to get your muscles that same increase in blood flow and that same desired heat that you're looking for. To the same extent, we always think about being too cold and heating ourselves up to a point where we're efficiently moving, and I'll talk about why that's important. But also in the summer, we get pretty darn hot, right? And so it's important to think about how long it might take to get yourself to that desired state in the summer versus the winter, and making sure you're not actually using too much energy to warm yourself up when it's really not needed. And so I'll talk about the time frame a little bit later, but again, just to be aware of the increased muscle temperature and what the external environment is going to do on that when you're actually heating it up. One of the big things that people ask a lot about is, can I just use a heated blanket? Can I use heat immersion? Can I use some warm tights, those type of things, instead of doing a extended warm up to get that same to get the same benefits out of heating up the skeletal muscle and the extremities? And my big answer for that is no. So yes, there is a place for it at times, but in general, no. And the reason for that is the difference between passive and active heating is we're not just looking at getting the skin to a certain temperature and getting the muscle itself to a certain temperature. There's also a lot of other things that go along with having that blood pump and that blood flow and doing an active warm up to get your skeletal muscle to that point. And some of the things that you're missing when you just use a heated blanket, we're going to talk about here in a second, but there's some of the different neural connections that come about by practicing and by warming up the muscle to that extent, which really is important when it comes to performance, but it's also important when it comes to energy conservation. So why do you actually want the muscles to be warm? Well, one of the big ones, again, comes down to injury prevention, which is what you guys asked about. And that's really looking at the viscoelasticity. So basically how flexible that muscle is, its ability to contract and expand and then also come back. So how elastic it is and the elastic properties with it. The more extensible the muscle is, i.e. when it's been warm, the less energy it takes to do that same thing. So if you're looking at stretching something like an elastic band, if the elastic band's been out in the cold and you go to stretch it, you really have to pull hard on it, which is going to take a lot more energy. You can think of it like that with a muscle as well. If the muscle hasn't been warmed up to that sufficient point, it's going to take more energy to get that muscle to contract to the extent that you want it to contract. Versus if it's warmer, you already have that pliability and it uses less energy to do so. So that's one of the big reasons there is just the actual extensibility. So that decreased resistance, that easier movement, and that supple muscle then is easier to move about the joint. If you have better movement about the joint, you have more efficient movement in general, which is less energy, which means you're going to have less energy depletion later on in your ride, which specifically for some of your longer rides is important. From an injury perspective, it's also important for some of your shorter rides. So any of your sprint type of activities, because if you don't have good extensibility right off the bat, and you go to take a really powerful revolution on the bike, or you really try to push to go up something or to get that speed coming off the line, you have a greater chance of potentially injuring yourself because the muscle isn't ready to do what you're asking it to do. So the muscle has a greater chance to potentially have a little bit of a tweak because it doesn't have that elastic ability that it normally would have when it's fully heated. So yes, passive heating can help, and it can be used sometimes to shorten a warm-up a little bit or in a multi-event day. So the main time that I would say I've used passive heating is with track and field athletes specifically. And passive heating can be anything from like your heating blanket, your massage, even emollient. So one of those bombs, something like that you put on, which is more of a friction that gets rubbed in and then cause a little bit of heating. It's mainly used in a multi-event day where somebody's done a full warm-up and they've gotten all the benefits out of doing a full warm-up. And I'll keep going through some of those other benefits that are going to come up here. But then they've got another event, maybe only an hour later. And it doesn't make sense at that point to do a full cool down and then do another 40-minute warm-up or another 20-minute warm-up, because the energy conservation within the day, they don't want to expend all that energy in that warm-up. So they might use a little bit of a passive heating element to allow them to do a slightly shorter warm-up for the next event. So my example would be with a heptathlete, for instance, in a one-day meet where they've got a lot of different things with track and field. That's when I've used more of some of that passive warm-up to get the muscles back to that place, but they've already done a full warm-up earlier on in the day. The other time that you'll see people use a passive or a heating blanket or an emollient or something on those lines is really in regards to tendon, and especially when it's quite cold out. So your patellar tendons, that tendon that attaches your quadricep to your kneecap or your kneecap down to your tibia, is one that is often used with a little bit of heat or a little bit of a friction site before somebody goes out and starts a full warm up. And the reason they do that is tendons sometimes just take that much longer to get warm. And so they'll use a little bit of a heating pad, a heating blanket, some A535 or Tiger Balm or something on those lines to get a little bit of extra heat into that before they go and they still do their full warm up afterwards. They just kind of give it a little bit of a kickstart. But in general, no, it's not a replacement. It would just be kind of an additive that you might use a little bit specifically on tendons, which take that little bit longer or are quite sore when you start a warm-up. So they're not quite as sore when you get started. Sorry, Sarah, were you saying something? I think your mic's off.
Sorry, I'm yelling at my kids.
Oh, no worries. I just saw your mouth moving, so I was like, okay, I know I can talk quickly, so definitely cut in and ask. I know there's a chat up here. I'm just not watching it too closely, so definitely cut in and ask if there's any questions at any point. So then past that, when we're going into, hold on, I want to make sure that you guys actually have the slide change because it did not want it. There we go. Then this is the second reason that I was kind of alluding to why we want to make sure we're not just doing a passive warm-up. So why we're not just using a hot shower, that type of thing, is neuromuscular activation. And it's really, really important, especially in sprint efforts, but really in any effort in general. And it's important for efficiency. But it's also important for timing and for performance. So a sprint effort specifically, there she goes, sorry guys, you need all the cylinders firing at the exact right time the race starts. So if you kind of think of it in a car aspect, you need everything to go right when you hit that gas pedal. But it goes further than that. You don't just need all the muscles to synapse at the right time, you need them to synapse in the right order. So here I wrote down reciprocal innervation, timing, and activation. And what that really means is we need to make sure that throughout our warm-up, by doing what we're doing, which is cycling, and I'll say why we're going to do a cycling for a cycling warm-up. We're not going to have you swim for cycling. But what we're looking at is we're looking at making sure that the muscle knows what it's doing, so that there's that brain loop going, and we're making sure that the right muscles are firing at the right time, and they're also turning off at the right time. So your quadriceps and your hamstrings are a good example, because you've got your quads kind of in the front, that front wheel drive, then you've got your hamstrings in the back or your glutes in the back, that rear wheel drive. And it's really important that they're firing at the right time, that they're not kind of coming together and then you're not getting good efficient movement. And so by doing a proper warm-up, you're making sure that they learn when they should be firing, at what part of that pedal stroke they should be coming in, when they should be letting off, and when they should be coming together all at the same time. So again, that's why I say it goes a little bit further than just the fact that they need to fire at that, but they need to fire at the right time. And really with reciprocal innervation, we're also looking at the relaxation of it, because you don't want to have one muscle fighting the other muscle when it's not in balance. So that neuromuscular activation is really, really important, not just to make sure you have the most muscle motor units firing together, but also that you have the ability to relax the muscle that you don't need to be working. And by doing a proper warm-up, you're getting all those things firing, and you're telling the body what it needs to be doing before you go into that activity. If you don't do that, so that's a practice makes perfect. If you don't do that in your warm-up and you go in cold and you haven't done a sufficient warm-up, you do run the chance of potentially having poor coordination of movement and not having the right sequence. So potentially having your hip flexor come in before your quad, or your calf doing more of the work when your hamstring should be kicking in, and them not coming in at the right exact time. So it's really important in your warm-up to do a cycling warm-up for a cycling event, so that everything starts to fire before you get into the actual event, into that actual race, from an injury perspective as well. Okay, so those are kind of the big reasons why you'd say physiologically you need to do a warm-up, but there's also the psychological part of a warm-up. And the psychological part of a warm-up is the part that we often do, but we kind of don't realize we're doing it. And so within that, I've got finding focus, finding your routine, having a strategy to your warm-up, positive self-talk, and safety. So I'm going to go into those a little bit further. But elite athletes have always trained their mind as much as they train their body. Some people say it's 80% mind, 20% body, 60%, 40%, 50-50, however you want to put it, but they always come hand in hand. And each person is going to really differ in their warm-up how much of the psychological aspect they have built into it from an individual basis versus from a team basis. Dedicating time in that warm-up when you maybe don't have time in the rest of your day because we're busy working, we're in school, we're doing other things, can be a really good way to work on some of these things. So that positive self-talk, the routine, the finding focus. It's a nice time to dedicate to spending a little bit more time on the mind aspect and not just the body aspect. Basically not using up energy that because you haven't had time to focus in your warm-up in your actual event. So when we go into finding your focus, what we're really talking about there is looking at what your daily short-term and your long-term goals are. So setting short-term and long-term goals maybe aren't something that you do in every single warm-up, but there may be something that you have done for the season that you can bring focus to in that warm-up, because the warm-up has such a routine that you have that time to really focus in on what that short-term goal is for that session, or what that short-term goal is for that event. With a short-term versus long-term goal, the nice thing about that short-term goal in your warm-up is it's something that's usually something that is achievable, something that's going to bring you a little bit of confidence to continue within that practice session or within that practice block, that brings you further towards that long-term goal that maybe is a little bit harder to achieve, really is going to take some dedication. It also brings back, by thinking about it in your warm-up and thinking about those short-term and long-term goals, it brings back purpose. Sometimes there's a training session that you really just don't want to do. I think we've all been there. There's many training sessions throughout my sporting career where I was like, the warm-up was the last thing I wanted to do because I really didn't want to be part of that training session either. It was just an extra thing that day and I just didn't have time for it in my mind. Having that warm-up and having that set time to really focus in on why I was there, knowing that that one practice will affect what my competition is later, brought focus back to that day and can give you that little extra motivation that you need to be ready to go as soon as that training session starts. So routine, and why is the routine really important? Well, we just talked about, I was just mentioning there how the finding focus is important with the short-term and long-term goals, but having that routine makes it that much easier to just build into it, to just get into your session right away. So it takes the guesswork out of it. It reduces the emotional energy expenditure that goes on with a training session. If you go right into your competition or you go right into that training session and you don't have a routine for that warm-up, you have to be thinking about, what do I need to do to make sure that I don't hurt myself? A few weeks ago, I kind of tweaked my quad. What should I do to make sure my quad feels good today? If you have a routine warm-up that covers all those bases, you're not putting that extra emotional energy into thinking about what you're going to do for that session, because you know you're ready to go. You have confidence in that training session or in that event that you're going to be safe and that you're going to be able to perform well. So routine is really, really important. When you're making that routine, it's also important to think about how flexible it is. And so you don't necessarily need a rigid routine. Often when we think about a routine with a warm-up, we think about these 5 things and this is what I'm going to do every single time. But routine really can be a framework. And earlier we said in the physiological side of things, what we're trying to do is we're trying to increase our heart rate. So we're trying to get our heart rate up so that we increase our core body temperature, as well as bring blood and oxygen to our skeletal muscle, increasing that elasticity throughout our skeletal muscle and get the neuromuscular firing patterns going. Well, those are the things that we're trying to do in a warm-up. So the routine really can be flexible around that. If you know you have less time, but you know you need to get your heart rate up, because that's one of the main goals of your warm-up, that's still part of the routine. I need to get my heart rate up. How can I do that? I might have to decrease the total time it takes for my warm-up, but increase the intensity. So your routine can be flexible as long as it's based upon goals from the physiological side of things, as well as from the psychological side of things, as to what you need. And everybody has a different routine. Everybody has different things that that bring up their arousal and bring down their arousal. Not everybody listens to Bombs Over Baghdad jumping around before an event. Some people like to rock out to some country, or some people like to do some guided meditation and breathing. But it's your routine, and you find what you need, and then make that carry forward in your training sessions as well as in your competition, so that you're used to it. It's something that you trust and you know you can work with moving forward. Strategy. So strategy is another part of the psychological part of a warm-up. Your race day strategy is probably something that's stabilized, wrong word, but something that's probably something that's already there and that you thought about prior to going into your warm-up. But sometimes your warm-up can be a time where you can go over that race day strategy in your head. For others, in that warm-up, it's a time to leave it alone. You've gone over it enough times already and you know you don't need to go there because that just adds to your anxiety levels or adds to that arousal. But really, again, this is something that you want to practice when you're building your warm-up, to know whether in that time frame, in your 20-minute, 40-minute, 60-minute, depending on the event warm-up, how much time are you going to dedicate to reviewing what your strategy is going to be for that training session or for that event, and make sure that you're not just practicing race day strategy and thinking about it during your warm-up on a race day, but you're also bringing that into your training session. So it's something, again, that you've practiced and is part of your routine. And then positive self-talk, big part of a warm-up. There's so many studies that have been done with elite and with amateur athletes in talking about what positive self-talk can do. The whole idea, if you believe it, you can manifest it. It's really important when you're looking at how to reduce that performance anxiety. Anxiety is one of those things that is a little bit of a wave. We all have it, we all need it, but when anxiety gets a little bit too high, it can impede on performance. And that positive self-talk can be something that can bring that anxiety back down to a level where it just allows you to perform really, really well. Positive affirmations can be anything from a mantra that you work on that you always say within your warm-up, to something that you're going to think about specifically towards your goal, to something that you're doing more as a group effort. You're going to have positive self-talk as I'm part of this team and I'm going to do this great as part of that environment or as part of my team member. But it is something that we don't necessarily think about quite enough, but a warm-up's a really good time to bring it in and see what it can do to change our performance in our training session. And then safety. So the psychological part, how does safety kind of work into it? This one may sound a little bit weird, but we do it in lots of other sport and we don't necessarily think about it in individual sport or in cycling, but it's huge. So in your warm-up, you also want to think about safety for yourself as well as safety for your equipment, I guess you'd say that way. So in that warm-up, part of what you're doing is you're making sure that everything feels right. And this is everything down to your clips on your shoes, so your equipment check of yourself, to the course, what's the environment like that day, what is the road like that day, what are the trails like. Part of your warm-up is feeling that out. Part of your warm-up is being able to get on that bike and really know that you're wearing the right stuff for that ride. You're not overdressed, you're not underdressed, that your shoes feel good. These are all things that you'd think about that you would maybe do beforehand, or maybe you checked the last training session and you haven't ridden since, but you just never know. And so in your warm-up, it's a really great time to actually just check in and make sure that everything feels right prior to your actual training event, because the littlest thing, your clip being slightly off, can cause like a numb foot. You can get an aroma that can happen on a longer ride. That can then lead to a blister. That can then lead to less training later on. So that safety check's really taking a look at how you feel, doing a body check, and then also what your equipment looks like and the environment at that time. Now, before I go to the next section, does anybody have any questions about any of the stuff that I've kind of ran through here so far? Nope.
This last slide made a lot of sense. I know for our athletes, the whole idea of equipment check is super important because you're riding really fast, and if it's not working and you fall off, it doesn't go well.
Absolutely. And it's one of those things that, like, I've worked as a first responder. That first side was me kind of in that first responder role, and I've worked in different cycling events. Big things happen when equipment's off. It's one of those things that it doesn't take much. And if it's part of your regular warm-up for your practice sessions where you're thinking about it and you're checking in on it, it then is something that you bring forward into that event day when there's all the extra variables of extra people, different weather conditions, all that kind of stuff. So really making it part of your routine takes away kind of the monotony of it as well. It becomes something that you're doing every single day, but it has purpose. You're doing this because it's just as important as getting your muscles and your head ready to go, is making sure your equipment's ready to go. Okay, so warm up, the building blocks, the length of a warm up. There is no right answer here. As much as I'd love to tell you a warm up has to be 5 minutes, it has to be 7 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour. There really isn't a great answer here, but what it does come down to is it's a little bit of an inverse relationship to the length of the training session or the event. So often, especially with kids, they think if I'm doing a really short time trial, I'm doing a really short race, then I don't need to have a long warm up, and it's really the opposite. The faster the sprint, the shorter the duration of the race, the more intense the duration of the race, usually the longer the warm-up is, because you need to get to that point where you're ready to fire at that 100% right off the bat, or that 80% right off the bat, where when you've got a much longer race, when you're looking at something that's 30 kilometers, 40 kilometers, 50 kilometers plus, you can't really have that super long warm-up because of the energy expenditure aspect of it. So you're going to have a shorter warm-up quite often, especially when you're looking at the mid-range as far as some of the distances. With the less elite, you're going to have a shorter warm-up in general because of that energy expenditure. And so the inverse relationship is really kind of a little bit of a play as far as how to build that out the best. But in general, if you're looking at a sprint, or if you're looking at a short course event, you want to have a longer warm up to really slowly build your heart rate, and then finish that warm up with some of those higher intensity efforts, but with long recovery built into it. And then also looking at how long that warm up is before the actual event starts. So the length of the warm up before the training session or before the event, if you've got that short sprint work and there might be a marshaling time and that type of thing, looking at how much recovery you have before you go into that sprint is really important. Where when you've got a 2 hour race, hour race, much longer race period, your warm-up can literally either become part of the actual event for your not elite athletes, or kind of lead right into it with a much shorter warm-up going into those longer events. And again, it's not just the energy expenditure, it's also the time that it takes. If you're doing a longer training session that day, you just don't have that large training block to go along with it. So then the choice of activity when you're building out that warm-up, I said it before and it just makes sense, and I don't think anybody sitting here would say any different. Sport specificity is key. Soccer players need to do vertical, lateral, stop-start movements. A cyclist needs to warm up by cycling. The idea that we're going to have you jump in the pool when you're doing a cycling event just doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, are there other ways that you could warm up some of those same muscles? Absolutely. If you're looking at the prime movers when you're looking at cycling, which muscles need to be warm? If you don't have access to the bike that you're going to be on because something has happened, especially when it comes to event and there's a last minute fix happening and you need to continue to warm up while somebody's fixing your bike, there are other things you can do, but in general, you want the majority of your warm-up to be on the bike. And that leads into that neuromuscular firing pattern as well, into getting the muscles working and getting that blood flow to the muscles that you're actually using. If somebody has a different opinion, I'm glad to chat about it, but typically you want to be on the bike when you're doing that warm-up, so that specificity is really key. The big thing that people often ask when they're building a warm-up is how much stretching do I need to incorporate into that warm-up? And again, it's not even on this slide, and it's not on this slide for a pretty big reason. I personally don't put much emphasis on stretching in a warm-up unless there's a specific injury that somebody's coming in with that they need some extra work on before they get onto that bike. And that really comes down to, are they coming in, for instance, with a back injury, and it just takes a little bit extra to warm up that back, other than being on the bike to get that back into a place where it's comfortable. And it's kind of like that tendon when I was talking in the knee. Are there times when I would potentially tell somebody I want them to do a little bit of an extra passive heating aspect to a tendon in a knee prior to getting into their full warm-up? Yes, maybe. Same thing with the back. There might be some extra some extra things when it comes to mobility for a back that I might do before they do their cycling warm up. But would I have somebody come off the bike and start doing a bunch of stretching? Absolutely not. Your warm up isn't a time to be working on flexibility. It's a time to be working on the elasticity and the mobility of the muscle that you're going to use. And the best way to do that is to gradually use that muscle in the activity that you're doing. So an example of a cycling warm-up, some of you guys may have seen this before. I put this up here just in case I can't get it to show. But when it comes to the length and building blocks, British Cycling has a lot of really great info out there, and this was a really simple one to follow. So I'm going to see if I can bring it up. If not, that is the link to it. Essentially, it's a 20-minute warm-up that they use for a bunch of different events. Within that 20-minute warm-up, they're doing exactly what we talked about earlier, which is essentially they're looking at gradually increasing heart rate, and they're gradually increasing heart rate by doing by gradually increasing the RPMs that they're biking at. So I'm going to see if I can pull up that slide. If I cannot, I will talk about that was my fear. Give me 2 seconds. I'm going to try sharing another slide here. So if I go stop sharing a screen. Okay. Ooh. Let's see if this works. Okay. Share screen. All right. Okay, can you guys see the indoor-outdoor 20-minute warm-up? Ah, victory. Okay, so within this warm-up, the reason I'm using this one is because it's a nice, easy one to follow, and it's open source, so anybody can use it. I wish I was able to pull up something from the Canadian cycling, from Canada Cycles. They do not have as much open source information that you can get your hands on. And the US one was rather crap. So I'm using this one because it's nice and easy to talk through. So again, it kind of just goes back to the physiological aspect of what they're doing in a warm up. It's a nice one to follow because as you can see, they start in with that 90 RPMs. Yes, they're doing this when you've got, at the bottom, it talks about being able to actually track some of this, but you can break warm up down using your RPE if people don't have that same ability when they're doing their training sessions, and matching their RPE, so their rate of perceived exertion, to kind of the RPMs that are broken down here. And I can talk about that a little bit later, but essentially what they look at here is they've got a gradual build over 20 minutes of increasing in intensities, and they're talking about within it having, once they get up into that 120 to 130, you see that it's a much shorter time frame that they're in it. And the reason for that, again, is we're not looking to expend a crazy amount of energy because you only have certain energy stores, but we need to get your heart rate up to a level that's going to bring all that blood where we want it to go and really start good metabolism, getting past that aerobic energy source. And then they also have broken into it these 6-second max efforts. The 6-second max efforts within your full minute of recovery, you're looking at a ratio there of 6 seconds to a minute of work to rest, which allows for not full recovery on that 6 seconds, but pretty close to full recovery of that energy expenditure before you do that next effort. Again, this is really important with that neuromuscular firing patterning prior to any type of sprint effort. So they've done a really good job of slowly warming up the body to a point where it's safe to get into some of those max efforts, but then have given you the rest and recovery in between each of those shorter max efforts prior to going into your actual warm-up. When you don't have access to something like RPM here, it's really quite easy to either use heart rate and look at gradually increasing your heart rate over periods of time. So looking at that first box here where they've got 5 minutes at a fairly low 90 RPM, you'd be looking at that first 5 minutes with your heart rate kind of getting into that 65% of the max heart rate. So being able to take your heart rate and figuring out what your resting is, and then getting a little bit higher, and looking at on an RPE scale of 1 to 10, where 10 being a full max effort, or 1 to 11, where 11 being a full max effort, looking in that first 5 minutes to be working in and around that kind of 4 level out of 10, which would be a level where you'd still be able to talk and have communication with your fellow riders, potentially even hum a little bit of a song. As you increase here, as you increase your RPM, you'd also be gradually increasing your rate of perceived exertion to the extent that when you get up into that 120, 130, prior to going into your 6 second after that 90 second, that you're looking closer up into that range of kind of that 7 out of 10 range, where you're not having a conversation with anybody, you're definitely not singing, but you're still not going at a full out max effort. And then in that 6 second max effort, getting into that 9 or 10 range, where you're going kind of as full out as you can, but for a really short period of time. And so if you regularly use RP with your athletes, it might be a little bit easier to kind of use it along that talk realm, where it's like, okay, guys, we're going at a pace right now where you can converse with people. Now we're picking up that pace where you can say a few words, but you're not going to be able to have that conversation. Now you're picking up a pace where you're not talking to anybody, but you still feel quite comfortable. And then getting to the pace where not only are you not talking to somebody, you're not feeling quite comfortable. You need the recovery that's coming in that 2 minutes back down into that level 4 or 5 on an RPE scale. I really find when I'm working with youth athletes, sometimes it's easier to kind of gauge on how somebody feels than it is if they don't have the tools, than it is to try to get them to take heart rates and that kind of thing on a live go, unless they've got the different heart rate monitors and things like that going on at the same time. So this is just one really basic example of a 20-minute warm-up that can be used for many different lengths of races. If you're doing really short sprint trials, I would say this is not long enough of a warm-up. You'd want to have 6 to 7 max, or 80% to 90% max efforts at the end, with probably more of a 20 to 30 minute gradual build up to that point. Again, just looking at being completely ready to fire and having a slower progressive build to get that heart rate up. Just going to get rid of this guy and come back to the slideshow. Does anybody have any questions about that one before I kind of move on? Sorry, I wish I was faster. Okay.
While you're doing that, I had one question on the stretching. Would you include rolling in that as well? Like no rolling before the warm-up?
Yeah, so again, Al's going to go specifically into the rolling, and I do talk about it a little bit in the cool down session here. But again, I wouldn't have rolling or trigger balls or anything like that as the core base of my warm-up, unless there's a specific area that you're going to do prior to getting in to the bulk of your warm-up. But to come off the bike and do some rolling before you get into the main training block, I wouldn't say is necessary. Rolling specifically, again, you're looking at kind of bringing some blood flow to an area. You're looking at the tissue elasticity. You're looking often at the fascia on the muscle and how that actually moves as well. So if there is a specific part of your body that you find you have a hard time, that never quite gets warm doing your regular cycling warm up, it might be something to do prior to your cycling warm-up itself, but you wouldn't spend a long period of time on it. And especially if you're doing outdoor riding, it's really not super appropriate, because you're getting off the bike, you're bringing down your heart rate, you're cooling down some of the muscle, especially right now. And if you're doing it beforehand and you're doing it outside, you're not really warm enough to get the benefits out of doing the rolling, as far as actually heating up the body and what you're doing from a physiological perspective to get going. Again, this all changes if you do have an injury or you do have a specific structure. I totally stopped doing what I was doing and just started talking, sorry. Or if you do have a specific structure that you want to spend a little bit more time on, I'd suggest you do it before you go to your training session. Potentially even if you're nice and warm in your house, you do a little bit of that trigger ball work or a little bit of that rolling. Then you get to where you're going, you hop on your bike and you start your warm up then. I just definitely would not have it be broken into the middle of your cycling warm up. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, it did. Perfect. I figured it'd be lumped in with the stretching thing, but wanted to make sure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I am really struggling here. Sorry. I'm going to just give this a, okay. What does everybody see right now?
You're not sharing your screen yet.
Okay, there we go. Thank you. And okay, this is not what I want either, but this is better. Am I sharing a screen now?
You are, but it's got like all the notes and everything like that on it.
Wrong screen. Screen sharing is stopped. Okay, perfect. You'd swear the thing would come up in the same position each time, but it is not. It's super fun. Okay, sorry about this. Am I sharing the screen now and it says PowerPoint in the works?
No.
Okay.
With the warm up.
Gosh.
With, screen one.
Screen one. Okay. We can make this happen.
No screen right now.
No screen right now. Okie dokie. If somebody is a whiz at this and they know what I'm doing and how it's wrong, please let me know. Because I've got it up in front of me, but you guys can't see it at the moment, right?
Yeah, it doesn't say that you're screen sharing.
Yeah, if you just share the screen, it should work.
Okay, and we want this one.
Yay.
Okay, and then we're gonna go to where we were. That's the notes, and we want that. Okay. Are we there?
Yep.
Awesome. Perfect. Okay, so what's not a warm-up? So this is kind of what we were just talking about. What do you not do in a warm-up? Well, it's not a time to do a whole bunch of full-out sprints. It is a time, though, to get up to that, to get pretty close to that pace, but without going overboard. So those kind of examples I showed there, work. Spend in a hard full-out max right before you go a 2 minute.
We're losing your audio, or I am.
Okay, I can hear you pretty clear. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're good now.
Okay, I'm not sure what happened there. I just pressed up, so we'll try there. It's not a time to try something new, so that's pretty obvious. Anytime you're doing a warm-up, specifically when you're looking at a competition, you want it to be something that is routine and something that is set. So it's not a time, I know especially with the youth athletes, when I work with youth athletes and you've got massage therapists or you have athletic therapists or physiotherapists at some of the different competitions, they're like, hey, they're here, let's go get a shake, let's go get a massage. Let's have somebody tape my foot when I normally tape it myself. Let's have somebody else deal with the blister. Not the time to do it. That happens with master athletes when I work things as well. You really want to use what you're used to using, so you're not adding something new in prior to competition that might not work for you. It's not a time to work on flexibility gains. And this comes right back down to the stretching that I was talking about before. Really, to change flexibility, to actually make gains in flexibility, you need to be spending an extensive amount of time in each of those stretches. Research has shown kind of 6 to 10 minutes in a stretch to really rip apart the muscle, allow it to stay apart long enough that then the cross bridges can reform and you have that changed length. Now, what does that sound like? Well, it sounds like injury, and that's exactly what changing that full length of that muscle is it's injuring that muscle for a short period of time to give that stretch. And so would you want to have a slightly damaged muscle before you go and do a big push or before you do a training session? No, it doesn't make sense. You're not going to have that same power conversion. You're not going to have as good a ride if you do that. So it's really not a time to work on flexibility gains. It's a time to warm up. It's a time to warm up what you already have and make sure everything's supple and ready to go, but not a time to try to change the length of your hamstring. It's also, warm up is not something to skip. If you're short on time, then you have to look at what your normal warm up is and figure out how to get your heart rate to that level, how to get your muscles to that level of extensibility in that shorter time frame. So again, looking at what the physiological aspects are and how you make sure that all fits in. You might have to adjust the intensity of your warm up if you've had to adjust the length. And you don't want to skip out any of those psychological components either. And it's not a time to forget about hydration and nutrition, but it's also not a time to try to really overcompensate. Specifically when you're looking at some of the longer rides and such, I really recommend talking to people that specialize in this. And there's some great sport dietitians and nutritionists that work out of the Sport Med Sounds Council that can talk about race day nutrition and the length of race nutrition and hydration. But in your warm-up, it is a time when you're doing some of these extended warm-ups to make sure that you keep your hydration level up. And if you do have a longer event coming afterwards or a shorter event, playing around a little bit with, well, having it prepared in advance, but playing around a little bit with the carbohydrates that you're taking in versus proteins, basic sugars, that type of thing, and what that looks like in regards to quick energy being used and then longer term energy being saved throughout the event. There's lots of different resources, and Heather Hines is a wealth of knowledge over at Sport Med Sounds Council that can go into those things. But specifically when you're looking at the nutrition and hydration side of things, people often think it's a race day, I need to try something new, I need to take in a new Gatorade, or I need to take in a new gel or something along those lines. And she's really great at making sure that you've got a plan set up for pre-event nutrition, pre-event hydration that isn't going to cost you a fortune either. She's got all sorts of fun recipes for some of those pre-event drinks and that kind of thing. So I would definitely recommend talking to her about that. But if you are super dehydrated, not a time to try to super hydrate. All you're going to do is go to the washroom a bunch and end up trying to hold your urine the entire ride. So really making sure that that's something that you've worked on prior. Okay, so skipping ahead into the cool down and why the cool down is important. So cool down or preparation. I like to call it preparation because your cool down is essentially you getting ready for your next event or your next training session. So you getting ready for your next warm up. If you don't do your cool down, then essentially you're going to have to add that on to the warm up of whatever your next training session is or your next event, because it's going to take that much longer to get to the place where you're ready to go. In your cool down, you really want to be aware of the elements. So again, if you're wet and cold, you need to get warm as part of your cool down. So after you actually get off the bike, after you've done a progressive slow cool down on the bike, if we're talking about doing some of that mobility work, and I know Al's going to go into that with you guys, I think in 2 weeks' time, into some of the specific mobility with injury prevention in mind as well. I'll talk a little bit about some of those things, but if you're cold and wet, you need to get dry and warm before you really do any of that stuff. So be aware of the elements, have the appropriate garments there to change into so you can continue your cool down. If it means having somebody throw you a sweatshirt that you can put on, something along those lines, it's really, really important because you want to progressively bring your heart rate down in that cool down, but you want to be aware of what the elements are doing to you as well. Safety is another big reason that we do a proper cool down, that we do a nice cool down, that we slowly bring our heart rate down. Getting off the bike too quickly can cause nausea. You can have a big rush of blood to the head, causing somebody to get dizzy or potentially fall over. You can have the shakes in your legs and your legs give out. And one little thing, jumping off the bike too soon, and having one little spill might mean that you're not back on the bike for quite some time. So safety is really important with that cool down. Also, especially in different types of road races and that kind of stuff, you have to be really aware of where the cool down takes place and how to transition into that zone if there's still other riders going. So safety in that cool down can be really important. And then the progressive active cool down, what does that really mean? 5 to 10 minutes is kind of my bare minimum with a cool down. And I would say at least half of that should be bringing your heart rate down and on a bike. If you've done any extent of a difficult ride, whether it be in intensity or in length, bringing down your rate of perceived exertion to that 4 to 6 out of 10 for that cool down. So you are still having some work, which really keeps that muscle pump going, which keeps that blood distributing and helps clear out some of the different metabolites. So physiologically, what does cool down do? We're looking at removing waste. So metabolites are left over from the ride, and we're removing them via that continuous muscle pump. So things like glycerol, free fatty acids, acetyl catamines, lactate, pyruvate, all those different things that get left over because of the energy that we've expended and how we've used that energy. We want to clear them out of the system and bring them back up to the main organs that can repurpose that energy and make sure that it's not kind of staying down into the legs. So your goal here is to keep the engine running, but in a comfortable zone. So we're not looking to push, we're looking to slow down, but we want to stay with that active recovery in that comfortable zone, allowing you to burn up any of that extra waste product that's been left behind without using too much excess energy in the process. Therefore, it's a gradual, progressive bringing down of your heart rate and bringing down that effort level, making sure that we are being cognizant of how our head's feeling, making sure we're not dizzy, that type of thing at the same time. And with your younger athletes, again, using that rate of perceived exertion, you want to get back to that extent where they can start to talk to people within that cool down. They're not pushing so much that it's difficult to talk. So you want to get back down into that talk test range, and then also bringing your heart rate down closer to your resting levels before you start to get off the bike and continue with the rest of your cool down. If you don't clear the waste, things like lactic acid buildup need to be cleared before your next warm-up, which means that next warm-up has to be that much more intense, which uses that much more energy that could instead be used in that training session. So keep that blood moving, keep that blood pump going, and get ready for some. So here's mobility. So this is where we get into getting to do some of that mobility. And the main focus when it comes to your cool down, again, is on imbalances. It's not necessarily on becoming Gumby or learning how to do the splits. It's looking at some of those imbalances. And so areas of focus for cyclists: hamstrings, calves, mid-back, especially rotation in the mid-back, low back extension, because we're in that flexion posture. Your neck and your shoulders are all areas that, because of the positions that you are while biking, especially road biking, mountain biking, you have a few different varieties in that. So you're going to have a few different things, wrists and such, that are going to come in there as much as well. But really looking at the flexibility and balances. So what position are you in when you're riding? What position therefore do you want to kind of do the reverse of when it comes to some of that mobility? So just because you've worked your quads, you've put a whole bunch of effort into your calves that ride, maybe you've done a ton of climbing, that type of thing, doesn't mean that's the only area that you want to do some mobility with. You also want to look at the reverse of that as well. So specifically, when we're talking about some of the maintenance side of things, if you're looking at kind of 5 to 10 minutes, so if your whole cool down is 5 to 10 minutes and you're doing 5 on the bike and you're doing 5 on the ground, you're only going to get in a few main muscle areas, a few main muscle groups. So it's really just has to be a maintenance thing. You're not going to be able to put a whole bunch of time into increasing flexibility here. So areas of focus, you want to think about yourself. You want to think about what you did that day. Was it a climb day? Was it a Was it a day where you spent an inordinate, much longer ride, really fighting wind that day? How did that change? What muscles were you kind of using more that day than you would another day? And then what are you doing for the rest of the day? Are you getting into a car so you're sitting again after a competition? Are you going back to class or to work where you're going to be sitting for a long period of time? What are the reverse muscles in those situations that you really want to work on? One of the ones that I wrote down right here, right off the bat, was hamstring. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about your hamstring and how you might stretch that hamstring. And I know Al will go into that a little bit later when you talk with him again. But hamstrings are often stretched in a flex forward position where the trunk is flexed forward as well. And with cycling, that's what we're doing. So really important when you're looking at doing some of that mobility maintenance for your hamstrings, that you try to do it without flexing the trunk. So you're looking at doing different stretching mechanisms that don't involve you having your trunk in that flex forward position, having your pelvis tucked under you, because you're already really good at that. You want to be looking at that hamstring with that back in a nice straight position. So maybe you're standing up and you've got your foot elevated on a bench. And from that respect, you're not having to tilt forward. Or maybe you're laying down on your back with your pelvis neutral and you're using a band or something like that to assist in that hamstring stretch. But really looking at making sure you're not doing that stretch in the same position that you just rode in is something that we often forget about, because we think a hamstring stretch is a hamstring stretch. But again, we want to be specific with it, and we want to get out of the position that we were doing with riding. And I say the same thing when it comes to your mid back and your low back, continuing to do a rolling motion. So always rolling if you're doing trigger point stuff, or if you're on a roller into that flexion position, you're already really good at flexing. So we want to be looking at doing the opposite. We want to be looking at doing some reverse into that extension. You can do that on a roller. You can do that with a trigger ball. So not everything in like a cat position where you're, or a child pose position where you're always leaning forward. You want to be looking at some of the reverse with that. And then rotation is really important. We don't think about that mid back and T-spine rotation all that much when we think about cycling and why it's important, but it's important because we don't do it when we cycle a bunch, but when we do, especially if we're talking about mountain bikers here, you need to be able to be supple, you need to be able to move and accept that load when you have the different changes throughout the terrain, and you don't want it to be jarring. And so that mid-back T-spine rotation is really important when you're looking at mountain bikers for an injury prevention side of things. And lots of different ways to do that. I'm sure Al will get the balls out and get the rollers out and talk to you about how to open up in those different positions. One of my favorite ones is simply a clock stretch where you're laying on your side, or the big comfy couch stretch where you're laying on your side with both arms reaching out to the side, and then you're looking to do a rotation. Again, you want to make sure that you're not collapsing in your low back when you're doing that. So really, when you're going into any of these areas of focus, and when you're working with Al in the next 2 sessions here, if you have questions specifically about it, ask questions about how do I stretch my back without going into that flexion posture, without going into that rounded posture that I already spend so much time in, because you really want to be looking at getting out of the positions that you're always in. Another one on here that I'm just going to briefly talk about from an injury perspective are your calves. And why do I worry about the calves? Well, because Achilles. And people always say, oh, you got an Achilles injury, throw them on a bike. But anybody who's ridden a bike for a long period of time knows people also have Achilles problems who are cyclists. And lots of that can come down to the bike fit. And I'll talk about that in a second here from an injury prevention aspect. But it also comes down into how you're training it. And so with your calves, really important that you're making sure that when you're doing some of that maintenance and mobility work, you're looking at not just the gastrocs, which would be a straight leg stretch when the knee is straight and the ankle is the only thing bent, but also when that knee is bent and the ankle is bent, and you get the soleus. And the soleus is really important when you're looking at your calf. So these are just some of the things that you might want to think about when you're working with Al, and he takes you through some of the specific stretches as to why you want to get into some of those different areas. Really what we're looking at doing is we're looking at using the elasticity that you've done throughout your workout, using that as a good time when you're already nice and warm to just work on that maintenance of mobility and look at the reversal of patterns. You're not looking at gaining incredible length at that time. And so for those people who like to roll, it's an awesome time to roll because you're already nice and warm and you can get into that flush a little bit more. And if you have the time, you can definitely make the mobility section not just maintenance by adding an extra 10 minutes and actually working on a specific area. But if you're only going to keep your cool down to that 5 to 10 minute time frame, then really you're just looking at maintenance. And then the psychological goals with the cool down. Well, it's a time of reflection, and I hated reflecting as an athlete in my cool down, but some people really like it, and some people use it really, really well. I think one of the teams that I worked with on a regular basis, their coach was really big on using the cool down as a time for them to go through what their race had been and go through how their race prep went, and then anything that wasn't positive in it, they noted it, they talk to their coach about it during that cool down period, and then they had to move on from it. So it was a time to leave it and go to the next thing. It was also a time for that coach. He said, you know what, celebrate your success right now, but then we've got a training session tomorrow. And so depending on the event and depending on how serious it is for that athlete, you can kind of keep it short or a little bit longer, but it can be a good time for some of that reflection. And then nutrition. Cool down, part of a good cool down is also starting that refuel process. Again, hydration and getting some protein and a carbohydrate source in. Hydration you can hit right away. And then when you're looking at the protein and carbohydrate source, it really depends when you're going to next have that option or what you have coming up as far as training later down the line. You want to get a protein source into you within 30 minutes of your event. And so if you've got it readily available and you're done your 5 minutes of that progressive cool down and maybe you're now working on mobility, great time to start. Can get some of that into you. You can combine it with hydration, some of those simple things like a chocolate milk. Maybe if you're an adult, a beer, one of those type of things, depending on the event, might be an okay to get some of those carbohydrates in you as well. And again, Heather's got all sorts of great homemade recovery drinks that actually taste not too bad. Ask her for her grape recipe. It's pretty awesome. It's not mine, so I can't put it on here, but Heather's got it, so you can get it from her then. But simple things for kids to have in their bag that they can have afterwards are things like chocolate milk, a few pretzels, graham crackers, that type of thing. And it's a good time. Carbohydrate you want to get into within 60 minutes, but if you can do a carbohydrate and protein source at the same time, you get a better bang for your buck. And then observation, your cool down is also an awesome time to start taking a look and again, kind of checking in. So what do your feet look like? The condition of your feet, your saddle, what does your saddle area look like? So this is a nice way of saying the lady and male bits that are down there. How's everything feeling? More so than the actual seat, the condition of your chamois, and doing just a full body screen here. And so when it comes to injury prevention, these are some main areas that I want you to put a little bit of focus in. And in your cool down, if you're noticing something, often when you get home, you might forget about it, specifically when you're looking at your feet and what condition your feet are in. Often that comes down to some of your equipment stuff. So if something feels off in your cool down, or you're starting to notice that you can start to feel your toes where maybe you couldn't feel them, that's something that can be worked on. And often people forget about it until the next session, until they're in it, and then they don't change it. So in the cool down, if you make notes of any of those type of things, it's a great time to look at that. When you're looking at your feet specifically with injury prevention, placement of the clip can make a very large difference in relation to some of the numbness that people will get into their toes. Slight moving it down or slight moving it up can play with something called a Morton's neuroma, or some of the different small neural tissue within the toes in relation to where the clip is. Looking at the fit of the shoe, the longer rides, your feet are going to swell a fair amount, which can cause some of the different frictions and things. A blister can take somebody out of training pretty darn quickly. So keeping an eye on things like that, any rubbing areas, those type of things, especially when you're working with young athletes. If they learn to treat their feet and they learn to pay attention to what their feet look like at a young age, it's something that's going to stick with them longer down the line. Foot condition, I was a soccer player. was something I never cared about. It was kind of just get through it, play on until you lose all your toenails and you can't play. So paying attention to your feet and cycling, feet can take you out for a long time. Saddle condition things that people don't like to talk about, especially when it comes down to your chamois as well. Things like folliculitis, so having a hair follicle get infected or inflamed, or a boil or a blister. Spin instructor, remember, I have had them both, because in spin we wear nice cute clothing and not our cycling shorts. I changed that. You definitely want to watch some of those things, and they're things that can keep people out as well. And a little folliculitis can turn into impetigo, which can keep an athlete out for a long period of time. And really, most of those things come down to friction. So again, teaching people young, teaching them early about how to avoid those things, looking at your chamois, looking at a bib chamois. If somebody's chamois is moving around all the time, it's going to stay in place a lot better. Looking at some of the different emollients that you can put onto the chamois and then onto the skin. You guys probably know this better than I do, but from an injury perspective, bringing that stuff home with your youth athletes, and then with any of your weekend warriors who are starting a little bit later that might not realize there's things they can do and things don't always need to hurt, and then making sure that you've got a saddle that's fit for you. Lots of women's saddles are actually terrible for most women's bodies. People often think they need to go bigger when they need to go smaller. So talking to somebody, a coach that you guys work with already, doing a proper bike fit, those type of things can really go a long way. And then your basic body screening, your cool down, if you can teach people early just to say, how do I feel? Does everything feel good? And just be aware of anything that doesn't, can save you a lot of irritation and problems in that next warm up, because you're aware of it. You can spend that little bit extra time and make that part of your cool down, spending that little bit of extra time with it. So modalities, when you're looking at a cool down, this is one of those big questions. Do you ice? What do you do? Do you use any of the fancy machines like a Normatec, the compression devices, all that kind of stuff? There's more and more evidence out there that's telling people to avoid ice most of the time. Okay, and the reason for that is that you want the inflammatory process that comes along with any injury, but that also comes along with any larger strength gain from the eccentric effort, to really take its place and allow you then to have growth outside of that. So do you ice after each session? Not unless you've been told to by somebody that you're working with. From an injury perspective, if you were going to use heat or ice, you'd be looking at doing more of a contrast type of situation with the heat and ice, looking at a 3-to-1 hot to cold. Again, just looking at blood pump and blood flow, but you can get what you want out of the cool down without jumping into one of those dreaded ice baths. Compression, on the other hand, is something that can be quite useful, and especially if in a cool down, it's cold out and you want to get some of those extra layers on, and you finish your cool down and now you're going to go sit at a desk and do a lot of work. You're going to get blood pool into the feet and into the lower extremities. So compression devices or compression stockings, tights, that kind of thing, can be really useful if you're going to be in an independent position where the feet or the legs are hanging down. I think I'm going a little over time here, so I'll try to wrap things up for you guys with this last slide here. Now, if you are injured in a ride, we've all heard of price or rice or police, but the new one is peace. And so if you're looking at any basic injury, this is kind of the thing to follow. And what peace stands for is, P is protection. And essentially you're trying to, if you've hurt yourself, you've done in your cool down, you've done your body scan, you've noticed that something's not right, you want to avoid any movements that cause increased pain. And the reason I say any movements that cause increased pain is because you don't want to just avoid all movement. You still need movement because it's going to help you heal, but you want to avoid movement that causes that increase in pain for kind of that 24 to 72 hours. The E is going to stand for elevation. Spotty research here, but there is some that still talks about if you do have an injured structure, trying to get it elevated to the level or above the heart. And again, this is just to stop any of those metabolites from pooling after an injury. A is to avoid that anti-inflammatory, so potentially to avoid any of those different medicines or ice for the same reason you want the inflammatory cascade to allow the body to heal. again, if you are told specifically to use something by your doctor, you can ask the question and they can explain to you why they want you to take that. But in general, you're avoiding anti-inflammatories or masking agents. C is compression, and I talked about how great compression was. Compression is the very first thing I make anybody do when they're injured from a physio standpoint, but it's also really great for recovery in general. But what compression does is it stops that blood pool from happening in that injured structure, pushes it back up to the heart, the same kind of way that elevation does. But you want that graduated compression, so the compression that's the tightest kind of in the lowest aspect and then moving up towards the body. And there's all sorts of different devices and socks and tights and all sorts of fun stuff with that. And then the last letter there is E, which is education. And this one really just comes down to listening to your body and not trying all the new fancy things and modalities that are out there to get you back on the bike sooner, but really listening to how you feel and working within your means, and then getting advice from the experts as to how to kind of speed all that recovery up and get you back on the bike that little bit sooner. That's about it. I've just got my name up there, and then some of my credentials there quickly. Like I said, I was a graduate of the university here, and I've done my diploma in sport physiotherapy and my international sport diploma as well. And then my functional dry needling, one of those modalities that everybody likes to use. But again, there's a time and a place for everything. And I'm currently working at Craven Sport Services, but have been kind of all over the place. But this is a time, if any of you guys do have some questions, I know I went a little over time here, but please fire away.
Well, thank you for your presentation. I'm wondering more about the, you're mentioning the ice stuff again, and I wouldn't mind seeing some of the reference sources now. I remember back in like 2012, etc., people were talking about it, and yeah, I guess I'm out of touch since it's fully moved over. I still thought that ice felt good, and I didn't know that that we've moved that far past it. I thought that was sort of one of those things. It was just kind of a home.
Well, the one of the things you just said there is ice feels good, and so one of the things that ice does do is it helps with pain relief. Yeah. And so from a feel good perspective, is there a reason? Is there a place for ice potentially when it comes to the pain relief side of things? Absolutely. And it's the same thing with the medication side of things. Can you take Advil if you've got an inflammation, and might it help with the inflammation, which then might take less pressure off some of the nerves that are causing pain? Yes. But from an actual physiological, is it going to increase healing? Is it going to speed up healing? Neither of them have good research that they will speed up healing. Now, with ice specifically, this is where it gets a little bit interesting, because I still am of the belief, and this is just based on what I've read, that the reason that they are saying no ice is because ice alone will slow down the inflammatory cascade. And this is what's coming out in the research. Now, if you cool something down and you cool your body down to a certain degree, and then it heats back up again, what have you just caused? You've caused circulation, and you've caused blood pump. And one of the things that we try to do when we're healing anything is to get blood pump, right? And so to say ice is 100% a no-go is jumping ahead too many steps that I'm not comfortable with. Now, using ice and using heat in a contrast aspect, there are still good studies that show that that is going to cause that blood pump, or using ice specifically for pain relief. But what the research that's coming out right now says, when it comes to speeding up healing times in relation to scarring, in relation to cross-bridging of muscles and all the rest of it, of myosin and actin fibers, when it comes to healing muscle, what ice will do is it will slow down that inflammatory cascade of the different macronutrients that are going to eventually cause healing. If you use it specifically with heat and with ice, I don't see how it can do that. But
what about the bringing down of core temperature stuff when we're racing in the heat? I thought that was another reason we put it on the.
So again, that's not so much when it comes to specific injury, but that would be a great reason why you might use some cooling effects for sure. Same thing when I talked about earlier, ambient temperature outside and what you have to be aware of when you're doing a warm-up. People will use ice in a super hot environment when they're doing prolonged warm-up, getting into a distance event to make sure that their core temperature doesn't get too hot, right? So they'll use cold cloths, they'll use cold vests, that type of thing. If somebody's overheated in an event, absolutely, cold immersion is still used to bring people back down to a safe level in emergency situations all the time, and in general when people are exercising in extreme heat or extreme humidity. So long story short, the new stuff that's coming out there that they're telling everybody to teach is peace. Is there a place for ice? Is there a place for cooling in elite sport? Absolutely. And is it still being used at the highest level when it comes to some of those things? For sure.
Yeah, I guess I'm just interested in finding a paper or what's the summary document these days on why we want to use peace instead of rice. If
you take a look at, I think, I will give you the British Journal of Sport Medicine. So BJSM has just come out with an article with peace specifically in it. Okay. And it's done by the running clinic guys. They're the people who are kind of making it look pretty, essentially. But that's the most recent article that I've read with peace in it.
Okay, so you don't believe that we're going from fat used to be bad to sugar was bad to
that's why I kind of said with a little bit of laughter, do I still use ice and heat? Yes. Okay. Do I still use contrast? Absolutely, because when you think about what are you actually trying to do is you're trying to get blood pump going. Do they want people using ice exclusively when it comes to a general training session where there hasn't been an injury? No.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions? Or is it just Russ and I left?
I'm not even sure which Chad we have, but I think, because, we can't see Chad, but I can recognize the voice, but can't be sure.
All right.
No, I'm a rookie in cycling, so Chad from Prince Albert, Chad Garrow.
Oh, okay, awesome.
Yeah, so.
Okay, different Chad.
There's lots of Chads out there, yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, I know your next session is on injury prevention as well, and so you can definitely, Christy will get into some of the specifics with common cycling injuries. And then Al is going to cover some of that mobility and stretching stuff, Chad, that you'd asked about in greater detail. So I think those should be great.
Okay. Thank you very much, Adrienne.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.